James, thank you. And I'll just stand up, don't worry about that. It's been fun to be here today. I don't know how many of you were here, but it's been really fun. And to engage folk with a deep and a keen sense of being God's people where you live. And so tonight, I want to engage you. I decided over supper that I wasn't going to be prophetic, and I wasn't going to be pastoral, but I was going to be something else. So now that I've set up, I better be prophetic and I better be pastoral to deal with that. A lot of people, when I get invited places, a lot of people are inviting me for two reasons. One, their congregations or their denominational systems are in free fall, and they're looking for somebody who could be a real mess to fix it. So I get invited in. And I work most of the time with large denominational systems at both national and what we call mid-level judicatories, and then gather all kinds of congregations around that. And I work with church leaders of all kinds at many different levels. The second reason I get invited in is because people see me as Mr. Missional. I'm one of those who, a long time ago, before some of you were born, was part of a group who wrote the book Missional Church. And from that period on, it stuck, and I became part of that conversation. And so many people invite me, and the basic questions that they gather are two. One, what is missional? And two, how do you do it? So I want to live into that a little bit tonight and then give us a chance to have some conversation together. Because actually the real encounter and learning isn't in this thing, but in the question and interaction that takes place. I don't know any of your church congregational, church planting contexts. What I do know, as I travel across North America, I do a lot of work in the UK and in Europe. Just got back from Korea, where in South Korea, the vaunted Church of South Korea is really in free fall. There's a sense among many that, and this may be less in the South than it is in the rest of North America, that the church that thrived in the 19th and early parts of the 20th century has fallen on bad times and hard times. And it's wrestling and it's struggling. And I use the language of unraveling. But that's not really why I'm here. What I'm here to talk about is that I am fundamentally convinced that the Spirit of God is up to something amazing amongst us in North America and in Europe. And that if we turn our eyes to existing church systems and even lots of church plants, we're actually going to miss what God's up to. And that the Spirit of God is messing with and turning upside down a lot of our understanding and practices of being God's people. And we are, and I would say this even as a guy with gray hair and getting relatively old, that we stand tiptoe at the edge of discovering some amazing things that God is up to. But it's not going to look like the way we've been church and the way we've been practicing. And that's a little bit about what's involved in this language of missional. Let me say a few things about this language and then talk about what it might mean to what I call join with the Spirit who is out ahead of us in our neighborhoods and our communities. I have to do that by telling a little bit of my own story, and I hope I don't bore you in that. As James pointed out, I grew up in Liverpool, England. If you know that city, it's famous for It's Liverpool Football Club. There are actually two football clubs, Liverpool and Everton, the Reds and the Blues. Nobody ever thinks about Everton very much, but Liverpool, that's the team. Well, I grew up 2.5 streets over from Liverpool, from Anfield and the football ground. And all around it is inner city. And I grew up in a poor, working class culture, society. I didn't know then that it was poor and working class. It was just kind of normal to me, so that's not a complaint. And I grew up largely shaped by street gangs and the almost complete absence of any sense of God or anything Christian. The only religious Christian things I was aware of was at the top of the street, there was an Anglican church, St. Cuthbert's, and every once in a while, a very, very tall, lanky guy in what seemed to me by like a very small bicycle would come out and dressed in a black suit with a collar on it and ride down the street, and I would look completely unable to understand what that was about. And every once in a while, when we got bored, we would break into that church to try to find something to steal or a place to smoke cigarettes. So basically, I grew up a happy pagan without any sense or need of God. Wasn't part of my life. And I emigrated to Canada. I didn't. My parents did. They took me out of my world. And they brought me to Canada. And in the space of a week, I moved from the inner city Liverpool, where I spoke Scouse, like how you do, love, do you want to go up to Backjigger and swap spits together? And maybe if you spot spits really loud enough, we can go get off Speller Lane. That's how we talked. And when I landed in Canada, literally, my wife will tell you, nobody understood a word I was saying, but I was speaking English. And that's a long story, out of which I did not get involved in a church until my late teens. And the reason I got involved in church is that I discovered in North America, you can't behave like you did in Liverpool, which is basically, if you look at me the wrong way, I'll beat you up. That kind of violence apparently was not appreciated. But what I discovered in Canada is that the middle class had a form of violence, but it was organized, and it was called hockey. And so I joined, without knowing it, I joined a hockey league, and it was a church hockey league. And somebody told me two things in that church hockey league. The first was, this was my first clue. The first was, the guy sat down beside me after a hockey game, and he said, "Alan, you really don't need to use the F word between every other word. It's not a conjunction." And secondly, he said, the reason you get ice time for 25 cents is because this is a church hockey league, and you should show your appreciation by turning up once in a while. And so, what the F? I decided to turn up. And I'll never forget the very first time I turned up at church. The very first time. I walked into a foyer, and it took my breath away because it was filled with nubile virgins. Girls. So I kept coming back. And that's where I met my wife. And I became a Christian in that church because people loved me very deeply. And when I asked them what the love was about, because I'd never experienced that before, they said it was about Jesus. So I remember one night in my own, with tears in my eyes, saying, "I don't understand this love, but it's about Jesus. I want to follow you, Jesus." That became a Christian. So once you become a Christian, Spirit gets inside, you start paying attention to what's going on at the front. So I began listening to the minister. I was about 17, 18. And I realized that what the minister was doing, this was a Baptist church, what the minister was doing was a religious form of what I grew up with. It's called guilt. And I walked out saying, I'll never go back. And I went to university to train to teach philosophy at university. And I was studying with a guy called T.F. Torrance. And God got me and called me to the church. And so without any church experience, I literally am called to the church. And so I go, and I say, well, where do I go? Now, one of the only churches I've known was Baptist. So I turn up at the Baptist church in Canada, and they say to me, all right, we'll take you, but you got to go to our seminary. So I went to this seminary, and at the end of it, I met in a room with 3 old men. They were probably younger than me. I met in a room with 3 old men, and they said, well, you've done very well. And I said, okay. And they gave me 4 sheets of paper, 4 sheets of paper, each with a church, and said, choose which one you want. That's how it was done in those days. This was before the flood. And so because I'm an urban guy, I went to the place closest to the city of Toronto, town of Newmarket. And when I got there, I was completely unaware of this, I discovered that they'd just done what in Canada we call Baptist church growth. That is, half the church had got ticked off with the pastor and kicked him out. And so he, hearing God clearly, left the church and took half the church with him. And I was left with the ones who were not going to go anywhere for anybody. So I get there, about 40-odd people, and without getting into it, over about an 8-year period, that 40 grew to 300 or 400, which in Canada is a big deal. And I was doing lots of things. I could preach well, created a worship band, had small groups, did groupie poopy, did all the stuff. Drama on a Sunday morning, on and on it went. And the church just grew like a bad weed. And I was becoming kind of a golden boy in my denomination. And one night, I was a distance runner in those days. I'd gone for a long run at the end of the summer. And this was about 7 years in. And I stopped. I'll never forget this. Hot August night. I stopped to cool down. And, true confession, I began to cry. And it wasn't, you guys, you need to understand this. It wasn't kind of a head trip crying. It was coming out of my guts. And I was weeping. Now, my wife describes me as an INTJ. You know what I mean by that, Myers-Briggs? An INTJ, okay? And her definition of an INTJ is that it takes you 6 months to catch up with your feelings. And I said to her, no, that's not an INTJ. Well, she said, well, what is an INTJ? An INTJ says, well, I had a feeling once, and I didn't like it, so I haven't had one ever since. And but anyway, I knew immediately why I was weeping, and here's why. I knew that I could be successful making a church grow. And I could go anywhere I wanted and make it grow, which I did. But here's what I knew. This is in Canada. I'm not talking about Houston or anywhere else. What I knew are 2 things. One, most of my generation had given up on the church, and they weren't coming back. I was in my late 30s at this point. And number 2, the reason my church was growing was circulation of the saints. You know what I mean by that? I was just better at what I did than all the other people, so they were coming my. And I said to myself, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. That's got to be the most boring way to live life, doing that kind of thing. So I either quit or rethink this. And I kept talking to my peers about, like, our generation's gone. How do we engage? And they kept looking at me and getting mad at me for asking these questions. So I did what in those days, one didn't know what else to do. What I'm trying to point out is, I stumbled into a lot of stuff. This is not about going away into somewhere and thinking about all of this and coming out with a plan. I stumbled into it. Because what I did is I went home and I said to Jane, I'm done, I'm quitting. And I did 3 things. One, I did the only thing that a good white Anglo-Saxon knows how to do when you're confused. I went back to school to get more education. How dumb can you be? So what I did is I went to a Jesuit seminary and started doctoral studies with the Jesuits. Best education I ever had. Secondly, I went into downtown Toronto into a Baptist church ready to close its doors, comprised of 30 senior citizens, and moved into the neighborhood. The third thing that I did is I asked, who else is asking the questions I'm asking? Because nobody in my tribe was asking them. And I started getting on planes. And it was there that I met Leslie Newbegin. And you know what it's like when you suddenly meet somebody who gives language to what you're wrestling with and experience. And that's what Newbegin was doing. And that's where, with Newbegin and with a group of others, I began to discover and wrestle with this question of missional, of being missional. So that's part of where this has come from. It's not come from sitting in a corner and writing a book. It came from a real struggle to understand what does it mean to form God's people in a culture and a society that has fundamentally left God behind. What does that look like? That's where the missional conversation came from. And in that context, in a group called the Gospel in Our Culture Network, we wrote a book called Missional Church, which, quite to our surprise, because we were a bunch of academics, kind of went viral and started to get picked up. And what happens, of course, when a book goes viral and gets picked up, is people keep asking you to speak. And so I go speaking places, and I keep getting asked the same questions over and over and over again. First question, what is missional? All right? Now, if you're an intuitive and an INTJ, you know what it is, and you wonder why everybody's dumb enough not to know what it is. And the second question they asked was, how do you do it? And you go, isn't it obvious? And and I began to realize, I'm slow, it takes time. I began to realize, everywhere I went, I kept getting asked the same question, what is missional? Until one day, I was in the UK, and I was at a consultation at Lambeth Palace with Graham Cray and a bunch of other leaders. Graham Cray is famous for his fresh expressions. And I just want to say, fresh expressions in England is not like the fresh expressions that over here. It's not one's good or bad, but it's not like it at all. And Graham stands up in response to something I'd said. And Graham, who's very, very polite, Bishop Graham Cray, said, well, over here, we don't use either the words missional or emergent. And so, being a brash North American, I said, you got to be kidding. Why? And Graham, in all his graciousness, said, well, what we find, this was 10 years ago, what we find is emergent over here is dividing and fighting language. It's about who's in and who's out. Okay, I get that. But secondly, he says, what we discover is that missional, nobody understands. And if you've got to explain a word 100 times to a group of people, or 10 times to a group of people, and they're still not getting it, then stop using it. And I went, well, he's right. It's not that it's a bad word. It's a technical academic word. And most people in most churches don't live in that world, and they go, what are you talking about? So you create all these PowerPoints to explain it, and they still go, what are you talking about? You see, we in the guild are not listening to the people on the ground. So I said to Graham, well, what language do you use? Which is when he introduced the language fresh expressions. And I said to him, Graham, that sounds like the stuff you spray after you leave the bathroom. And he says, exactly. He said, now, it's got other language. I mean, it comes out in Anglicanism, it comes out of the, if you wish, the covenant or the vow, that a priest makes at ordination, to continually strive to be faithful to the gospel and create new, fresh expressions of it. But at another level, it's a neutral word. And I began to realize, if we're going to make sense of this missional stuff, we got to speak English to people, or at least American. And so I began to test and experiment and begin to think, what might that look like? And it was in that context that, in reading David Bosch and others, I came across Luke Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And in engaging those scriptures, missional came into focus, and my dis-ease with the language began to make sense. Because you see, just let me digress for a moment. In my connecting with Leslie Newbegin, in conversation with him, and in reading lots of his stuff, one thing was very, very clear to me. It was that Newbegin, he never used the word missional, but Newbegin, do you know who I mean by Leslie Newbegin? St. Leslie of Newbegin, the British missiologist. Newbegin, how many of you do not know who Leslie Newbegin is? Just, yeah, honesty is a good thing, folks. It's really... Leslie Newbegin was an Englishman, kind of United Methodist kind of guy, who went to Oxford to train to be basically business management, and met Jesus through the student Christian movement, and through a lot of things, in 1938, became a missionary to India. And when he went off to India, he discovered several things. One, the nice, clear understanding of the gospel that he had and was taking in a nice package to the people of India made no sense over there. And he began to discover, if there was going to be any communication of who God was and what Jesus was up to, it wasn't doing this. It was learning to sit in the midst of the village with the people of the village and enter their language and their life and their realities, and only in that context to begin to understand how to talk about the gospel. The second thing that happened to Newbegin, and this is conflating a lot of stuff, is that he really actually didn't go back to England very much over a 30-plus year period. He was in Europe a lot with WCC and other things. And he began to see, while he was in India, he began to see, think of the Beatles, European and North American young people going to India, and when they got there, literally disposing of all their Western clothing and taking on Indian clothing and Indian ways. And he began to say, what's going on? What's happening? How can a culture so deeply embedded in the gospel suddenly create generations who throw it off and want nothing to do with it? What's going on? And it was then, in his early retirement, many years later, in his return to England, coming through Europe, it becomes clear to him. This is obvious stuff now, but in the 70s it wasn't. It becomes clear to him that the Europe that he'd left and the England that he'd left was no longer Christian. And the young people were lost and wandering without any story. And he asked the question, how can this gospel re-engage this Europe, this England, this culture in which we live? Now, to put that formally, Newbegin's conversation and question in all his writings was, what's the relationship between the gospel and the culture, the people, the places where we live? And the more I read that, the more I realized that those of us who wrote the book Missional Church had made a massive mistake, a mistake that demonstrated our own captivity. And I realized that missional for us was an adjectival modifier of church. In other words, I realized, confessionally, that our whole way of thinking and imagining and doing was about church, about making the church work, making the church successful. Missional was ecclesiocentric, if you want a big word. And it was a stunning recognition for me. It was utterly disorienting because I believed deeply in what Newbigin was up to. And I began to ask the question, what do we do then? And I have to confess to you, this was a profoundly disorienting experience. Because I cashed in and staked the bank account on this missional church stuff. And I realized I was just playing the church game all over again. All over again. And I didn't know what to do. And both of those things are important. Because you see, it's very, very difficult to be a leader in North America and be at a place where you don't know what to do. Because you see, we are the culture of we have the technology, we can fix it. And so I began to try to figure this out. And that journey took time. I don't need to get into it with you. But I started, through David Bosch and others, to work with text and scripture. And part of what Bosch is saying in his book, Transforming Mission, which is quite old now, but still, I think, an incredible standard. And Bosch was a New Testament scholar in South Africa. And part of what he was saying was that when you get to the book of Acts, what you're dealing with, particularly in the first 8 or 9 chapters, is really a description of the disruptive work of the Spirit. That almost every time you turn around, what the Spirit of God is doing is just messing with all the plans and strategies of the leaders of the church. So, for example, you take Pentecost, and what happens that within a millisecond of Pentecost, the leaders of the church, I think we call them apostles, had figured out what this was all about. This movement of Jesus was fundamentally a Jewish sectarian movement that was renewing a Jewish imagination of what God was up to, which is why, fundamentally, they said, we're to be teachers of this in the temple, which was at the center, and we'll get some other people to look after some other things, but this is all about Jerusalem and the temple. And by the way, now we've got big questions about who's in and who's out. Remember, what can you eat? What can't you eat? What do we do with Judaizers? What do we do with God-fearers? All about who's in and out. In other words, without taking a lot of time on this, right within a millisecond of Pentecost, they'd put God in a predetermined box, and all the rest was marketing. There was a bit more than that. And what happens, and even if you go, remember Stephen's address before he's stoned? All of it in that address, while it's about who is this Jesus, it's all about this Jesus inside a Judaism. There's not a missionary imagination in this for the world. And inside of that, says Bosch, the Spirit comes and disrupts. The Spirit comes and turns things upside down. And that was the persecution that ended it with other things. So the book of Acts, these early parts of the book of Acts, is really about the disruptive work of the Spirit and about the fact that, as Joel Green describes it, the big boys in Jerusalem don't have a clue what's going on and are racing to catch up with what the Spirit's doing. Remember the instructions, when you leave the city, to the Christians, only go to the synagogue to speak of Jesus. Don't go anywhere else. Well, you can't control this stuff when the Spirit's at work. They go to Antioch and they speak to pagans and God-fearers, and something else takes place. So that's what's going on. Now, what that does is create a crisis at multiple levels, because you see, the story had been that Jesus is the fulfillment of all that God had promised. The kingdom, the shalom of God. Finally, after all these years, God had come and promised, and in Jesus, God was going to fulfill. And what that meant, in their interpretation of their scriptures, was restoration of the temple, God reigning in the temple, the kingdoms of this earth, think Rome, bending their knees and coming to the temple where Jesus would reign, coming back soon, and saying, "My Lord and my God." And from the temple, waters would flow out to all the four corners of the earth, and the land would turn verdant, and the world would be green and restored, and the lamb would lie down with the lion, and the swords would be turned into pruning hooks. This is what was expected. And by 60, 70 AD, none of it had taken place. None of it. The very opposite. Jerusalem was torn down, the temple gone, the earth around it salted, Jews not allowed to come back. Rome was definitely not bending its knee and saying, "My Lord and my God." And people were beginning to ask, what's gone wrong? And as Bosch says, Luke, part of the reason Luke writes is to say, in a sense, nothing's gone wrong. You put God in a box, and your picture of what God's up to is far, far too small. And the Spirit of God has too much for you to do to leave you there in that little box. And so the Spirit of God, right at the beginning, is disrupting and tearing apart in order to push you out into where God is at work. And I began to say, that's the story that I've been in. Thinking all the time it's about the church, making the church grow, making the church work, making the church healthy, making it emergent church, fresh expressions church, simple church, whatever church you want to name. It's all been preoccupied with this, and that's not what God's about in the world. And I began to realize that for me, missional equal church. But that's not what God was up to, and that's not what Newbegin meant. And so I began to search around for metaphors and images, particularly in the scriptures. And it's there that I then stumbled into Luke, because in a sense, not completely, Luke's gospel is giving illustrations of a response to the question, what do we do when all our normative expectations about what things ought to look like don't happen? And it's there that I stumbled into Luke 10. I didn't quite stumble into it, actually. A friend of mine introduced it, who had gone up into Alaska amongst some First Nations people. And he'd gone into Alaska as a white guy with answers. And when he got there, I can't remember the name of the First Nations people, they sat him down and they said to him, before you talk to us, you've got to dwell with us. And we dwell in this text, and we want to give you this text because we believe the Spirit is in this text. That's where Luke 10 came from in terms of its conversation in the missional conversation. And Luke 10, 1 through 12, began to give me a fresh insight and a fresh understanding of what Newbegin was up to and what missional really means. And here's the piece. Luke 10, you're probably all familiar with it, is where Luke is addressing the question of discipleship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And you get that in the earlier chapter where people come and say, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, great, sell everything. And they go, not that much. Or, I want to follow you. Jesus, great, come. And they said, well, give me some time to bury my family. Jesus says, no, you can't do that. This is all about discipleship. And immediately after those events, it says, and after these things, he sent out 70 others, i.e., no names, i.e., ordinary people. And that gives you lots of clues. God doesn't change the world through big leaders. God changes the world through ordinary men and women, most of whom we as leaders look at and go, why are they here, and what are they doing? That's how God changes the world. Through 70 others. Now, there's more going on. We know that. 70, 72 refers to the elders of Israel in the wilderness. So there's more going on than just that. I know that. He sends them out. And he sends out the 70, and he says to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask, tense of the verb, as you go. So this is not about a church prayer meeting. As you go, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And the text is ambiguous. I say to people, most of us read that whole text literally, but we turn harvest into a metaphor. Why do we do that? Maybe it's quite literal that Jesus is standing there and there's a huge harvest to be taken in. Anyway, and then he says, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest, but you go on your way and don't take with you a coat, an extra coat, extra pair of shoes. In other words, leave your stuff at home. Leave all your church stuff at home. Don't take it with you. Because if you take your church stuff with you, you don't stand a chance of hearing what the Spirit is up to out there ahead of you. And when you enter a town, you knock at the doors, you say shalom, and if the person is shalom there, the shalom will stay with that person. If not, it will return to you. And you enter that household, and you stay in that household, and you don't move around from place to place. And you eat what is set before you, Jews, because in Galilee of the Gentiles, there are Gentiles there, and they're going to put pork in front of you. So this is not about your taste, which is what most of our worship is about. Because the laborer deserves to be paid, which means join the economic life of the ecumene, of the household where you're going. And I'm reading this, and it's a radical inversion of everything I've believed. And I'm getting messed with massively. Because you see, here's what I'm reading. And I could do this a lot more, but I don't have this time. Here's what I'm reading. What Luke is saying, and I think what the Spirit is saying to us, this is missional. We are at a place. Now, here's what I mean by we, and I need you to understand this. By we, I mean people who look like me. White, Euro-tribal people. If you're from an African American church, an Hispanic church, you make your own translations. I'm talking about the Euro-tribal churches that used to have domain and power and be in charge. And who used to think it was all about the tactics to make y'all like us and come join us, because we had it right. What the Spirit of God is saying out of this text to me was, we are at a place as Euro-tribal churches where we've spent half a century trying to fix the church and make it work again. We've spent half a century trying to get the church back to the center of the culture and take the culture back for us. And the Spirit of God is saying, that game is over. Lay it down. There's no future in it. Now, don't misunderstand me. There's enough anxious middle-class people to fill a lot of the big churches around here. But it's still a sideshow, folks. It's not what's going on in the world. And the Spirit is saying, if you want to know what God is up to, you got to move into the neighborhood. And you got to dwell in the neighborhood. And you've got to learn how to receive the hospitality of the folk across the street and beside you. And this can't be a hit and run event. You got to live down in this place and be there and love and be present. One of the implications is stop getting in cars and driving 20 miles to church. That's not going to do it. And so I began to realize that I couldn't use the missional language anymore, because every time I use the missional language, people go, church, church, church. And so I began to talk about joining God in the neighborhood. That's what it's about. Go local. Dwelling at the corner of where we live. And so that was my journey. And so, pastor for 25 years, seminary educator for 5 years, working with churches all over the world, I moved back in the neighborhood. Literally. We said, as an extended family, we will only be church amongst God's people when we can walk. I'm an Anglican. It's called a parish. And it's a great idea. And it needs to be rediscovered. And it's about learning to listen and be present and engage the folk beside us and across the street and across the alleyway and enter into their world and their lives, not with a plan about how to get them into my church, but how do we gather around table? Because you see, table is one of the most sacred things in God's creation. Food is the anticipation of Eucharist and of God's presence. And when you sit with the other around table, it's stunning the conversations that go on. It's amazing the things that the Spirit of God begins to do. And what I'm discovering is that God's out ahead, and God's up to amazing things in the neighborhood. So for me, missional is no longer an adjectival modifier of church. It's about how we learn a whole different set of practices of going out ahead and joining with God in our neighborhoods, because that's where we will discover what it means to be God's people today. I've got 4 minutes to spare. God be with you.